Thank you for joining. Quite a day, quite a week, quite a year, to be honest, to be doing the work that we do. I'm Laura. I'm the founder and CEO of Diversio. I don't know, Daniel and Zakeana, if you've already introduced yourself.
Not as yet. I'm Daniel Fellows, the General Manager of the UK and Europe, driving the expansion of Diversio in this continent. Zakeana?
And I'm Zakeana Reid, Chief Operating Officer of Diversio EDU, the education arm of Diversio.
Fabulous. And we are here to talk today about the shifting dynamics that we're looking at when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, merit, accessibility, belonging. We know a lot of you are probably thinking about, DEI as a concept. How do we keep it going in our company? And is there some sort of rebranding or refocusing that we should be doing to better reflect the work that's ongoing? So the content for today, wanted to run you through a few things. We like to start with the data and start with the facts, and that's difficult to do sometimes in a media firestorm. And so what we did is we sat down and we said, what is the law? What are the policies? What are the executive orders in the United States and beyond? What do they actually say? And then put that in the context of other, another layer of legislation in the US that's been in existence for the past several decades. And then a further layer, and thank you, Daniel, for joining. You can certainly pile on here. What is the rest of the world doing? And how is it approaching and tackling, topics like merit, belonging, diversity, inclusion, et cetera? A lot of you are probably asking yourself what's coming, what is likely to happen. It's, very difficult, particularly now, to predict what the next policy or legislative priority will be, but we did our best. And then again, in the spirit of today's roundtable topic, I think a lot of you are probably thinking about what next and how do we react to these pressures, to these trends, and really kind of buckle down to keep doing our good work. Fabulous. So I'm going to ask, Zakeana, Daniel, please pile on if there's any area where you have additional comments or questions you think the group might have. And then certainly during the end, we want to leave a lot of time for discussion. I know, Zakeana, you bring a fantastic education and policy perspective to the table. And Daniel, of course, you sit across the pond. So I'm sure folks will be quite interested. Okay, let's start with what has predominated headlines. So the US, you may have seen earlier last month, late last month, I suppose, forthwith issued 2 executive orders that made a lot of noise. And so what did those orders actually say? How has the law been changed? The first executive order really focuses on federal contractors. So these are companies that act as suppliers for the federal government. So think defense contractors, think cleaning companies that clean federal buildings. So a very narrow and specific group of organizations. And what it does is it restores merit-based hiring and opportunity, which basically means, DEI will be under extreme scrutiny and absolutely should be looked at with a fine-tooth comb at that set of companies. And the second, also headline-grabbing executive order applies to federal agencies, so U.S. federal government workers, and effectively prohibits or eliminates DEI offices and programs within the federal government. And then, of course, many of you, I'm sure, tuned into Davos or heard about Davos, which is a global convening of, political and business leaders. And the president made some very strong statements about the illegality of DEI and his intent to prosecute or to crack down on folks who are, pursuing these policies. I think understanding is that these remarks were intended to having a chilling effect more than a legal effect, and absolutely in a lot of ways have had that. I think it's helpful to take a step back. So DEI over the past, when we started, I know, Zakeana, certainly when you started, because there was a D at the end of that acronym, we actually talked about D and I. And the acronym DEI really, I think, came into favor in the past probably 5 years. And it's been used to cover a lot of ground. So it's absolutely a broad-facing acronym. I think it's important to understand what we mean when we say DEI, and particularly what does the president mean when he says DEI. And so what we did is we really scoured and analyzed, the statements, the executive orders, commentary, specific targeting of programs to understand what counts as DEI according to the administration, and what might we consider DEI that's very likely to be safe and uncontroversial. And so what we're seeing is the programs that are really coming under fire. I think the first is anything around a hiring quota is absolutely being challenged. Any sort of training around privilege or white supremacy, anything that feels like it's blaming of any dominant group. Messaging around systemic racism and sexism is being criticized, guilt-based language, and of course, per the first executive order, supplier diversity programs, which for those of you who aren't familiar, that's large companies who buy a lot of little products to sell or to build their big product will often say we want to buy those products from a diverse group of companies, and so that's coming under fire. But what is outside of DEI? So what kind of practice, probably that a lot of you are involved with, that's, very unlikely to be challenged? Broad cultural improvement programs, so think team building, think skill building, are unlikely to be challenged. That's, critical and essential to how companies run, is you need a good culture, a strong sense of productivity and engagement. Workforce optimization programs. So again, looking at things like trends in churn, trends in promotions should be safe. Again, skill building initiatives. So maybe you want to, build leadership skills, even inclusive leadership skills, things like that should be safe. And then even metrics-driven analysis of the workforce. So looking, for example, at, again, trends in promotion. So women versus men, different age demographics, et cetera, should be fine, provided that it's not wrapped in DEI language. So that kind of outside terminology seems to be important with what gets targeted. So again, that's what's made news. So this idea of a chilling effect absolutely was the intent and absolutely is occurring. But, and I'll come back to this in a moment, there are a number of other laws that are still in place in the United States that mandate a lot of what we also consider DEI. And so, for example, at the moment, EEO reporting, which is the obligation of US companies to collect demographic data and report it to the government, that's still in place. Federal laws like Title VII, the Americans with Disability Act, et cetera, mandating fair treatment and accommodation, still in place. And then, of course, a number of states and localities, municipalities have things like, board diversity reporting, pay transparency, anti-harassment training requirements. I think something like, and Zakeana, you'll probably know this, anti-harassment training is in force in something like 30 states. And then, of course, there is a legal requirement and a common law requirement to maintain a work environment that's free from harassment, violence, and toxic behavior. So again, I think I'm a lawyer, so I tend to be technical. These are congressionally approved, uncontroversial laws of the nation that have been enforced for decades. So again, anything can happen, but that's the state of play for the moment. I might really quickly, I'll give the state of play, and then Daniel, I'd love for you to pile in on what you're seeing across the pond. But we also sat down, I'm an American citizen, I'm also a Canadian citizen. So for me, watching the commentary and the developments has been, like, frankly, hard to believe and the direction that we're going. And so we sat down and we said, okay, what are the DEI laws and policies in different countries? And, where does that put us? And that helps us predict the future in terms of where countries and laws might go. And so this is a bit of a cheeky slide, but it is true. It's based on fact. On the left hand of the spectrum, you have the European Union, which has been incredibly proactive, even, recently on DEI reporting. In the middle, you have places like the Nordics, like New Zealand, the UK, like Canada, where there is some level of DEI reporting, whether it's, and Zakeana, you'll have lots to say about federal reporting on diversity and inclusion, et cetera. And then on the other side of the spectrum, of course, you have the United States under the administration specifically. And then you have places like North Korea, you have places like Russia, you have places like Afghanistan. So it is a different, of course, area to be in. So Daniel, if you have any thoughts on maybe this side of the spectrum, and then I'm happy to switch to the EU side if you want to give an overview of the ESRS guidelines.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Fascinating stuff. Very fluid, as you said. I'm in London. Obviously, the UK isn't part of the EU, but the UK's stronger legal safeguards do provide a sort of baseline protection for companies who are continuing to work within the D&I space. It also makes it harder for companies to reduce or that terrible expression, walk back all D&I measures. The newly formed Labour government that came into force in 2024, they also intend to make it compulsory in April for all larger companies to publish ethnicity and disability pay gap through the Equality, Race and Disability Bill. And we also have the incoming Employment Rights Bill, also emphasises the importance of creating safe and inclusive workplaces. And we have the recent focus on preventing sexual harassment. That's compulsory training for every single company within the EU or the UK, or having that training available as and when they need it. And I think the legislative action really underscores the requirement for organisations to be very proactive in the measures to prevent harassment and foster a culture of respect and inclusion. And if we jump over the channel, the French channel, for 1 hour, we've got the reporting directives across the European Union, all of those folks on the far left-hand side. The law requires companies to report on environmental and the social impact. The CSRD, we've got lots of great information on our website, was adopted in 21. It came into effect in 2024, and it's enforceable in 2025. So this is an optional. These are laws within the UK and the EU. And again, chatting to some pretty large partners this week from Deutsche Bank and also Novo Nordisk. They have a lot of folks across the US and Canada. They're absolutely continuing in everything they're doing. For those of you that don't know, Novo Nordisk is a leading global healthcare company founded in 1923 and headquartered in Denmark. They've got 73,000 employees. Their market capitalization, it's incredible, is $570 billion as of April 2024. This makes it the most valuable company in Europe and larger than the entire economy of Denmark. So I'll let that sink in for a moment, but I had the pleasure of chatting with Suzanne D. Pedersen, the Vice President of Global Diversity, Equity and Inclusion this week, and she said how incredibly proud everybody within the organization is to work under the leadership of Lars, their CEO. D&I, the values really permeate the culture at Novo Nordisk. I've got a quote from him. He said, fundamental outlook as an innovation-based company is that a company becomes strong from diversity. The ability to include everyone defines our competitiveness. We have the approach that all employees should be able to meet and be themselves and contribute with what they have to contribute. We are an inclusive company for people who come from diverse backgrounds. That has always been the core of it. So that was, can you imagine your CEO saying that? I mean, obviously Laura says it to us every single day, but we are a diversity company. And Deutsche Bank, the CEO, Kristen, he echoed those sentiments as well. So from the fireside chats I've had with people the past 4 or 5 weeks, 99.9% of people are very much staying the course, doubling down, continue to invest, and to really champion both internally and externally across diversity, equity, and inclusion.
That's great. Thank you, Daniel. And before we deep dive on the EU, Zakeana, I'd love to maybe hear from you. And you're sitting in Alberta, so I'm sure quite a diverse view. But talk to us about Canada. What's the state of play as you see it in Canada?
So what I find fascinating, Laura, is that both Canada and the US have layered legislation. So they have both federal and state/provincial. And that in Canada, it impacts different industries. In the US, it's an actual layering. So while we're seeing a little bit of a peeling away at the federal level, we aren't seeing the same at the state level. And here in Canada, we aren't seeing a lot of movement there. However, it is surprising some of the organizations, and I speak sitting here in Alberta, which has demographics and sentiments that more strongly align towards and lean towards the US sentiment around D&I, and seeing some big players in this space dialing back while observing other provinces and major clients in other provinces really upping their game and committing to staying the course, recognizing that this isn't a fad or a phase. There are a lot of fundamental, basic human resources, best practices upon which DEI is founded. And there's always going to be space to create places where employees feel valued and respected, and that contributions from employees in those types of working environment tend to create engagement, which we know drives business results.
Really helpful. Thank you, Zakeana. Maybe I do want to deep dive a bit on the EU. Daniel, you and I have spoken about this at length, to say the least. And you mentioned earlier CSCR, and of course, one big component of CSCR is something called ESRS, which is the workforce reporting component of this big law that the EU just passed. So maybe, Daniel, talk to us about that regulation and what that looks like and who it applies to.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's very, very acronym heavy. So apologies to folks on the call today, but the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, ESRS, are comprehensive regulations established by the European Union under the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is CSRD, which expands the scope and detail of sustainability reporting beyond what was traditionally required under non-financial reporting directive. They require much more detailed reporting on environmental, social and governance, so ESG, factors by companies ensuring transparency and accountability in sustainable reporting. The ESRS are part of the EU's broader effort to integrate sustainable practices. Who does it apply for? Pretty much everybody, from listed and small, medium enterprise companies, so SMEs, large public interest entities, PIEs, other companies based on size and interest. And as I said, it came into law in 2023, and it's enforceable going forward from 2024 as well. So the first wave of reporting began in 2024. ERS applies to a broad range of companies, primarily targeting large and publicly listed companies within the European Union, even if you do have a company based across over in the UK. But the aim is to create, to encourage and also to enforce a more uniform and transparent framework for sustainability reporting, which is becoming increasingly important to investors, regulators, and also the general public. Effectively begins with data collecting and reporting processes. So to comply with CSRD, organizations must use ESRS. Specifically, I did warn you, ESRS 1 on own workforce for preparing ESG disclosure. So I won't go through them all, but some of these areas, the 17 different ones, you have to collect diversity metrics around social protection, persons with disability, work-life balance metrics, compensation, procedures to remedy negative impact in channels for own workers. So think around sexual harassment. So there's a huge amount of data that must be collected from all of your employees. There are local and regional nuances in terms of what you are able to collect and what you can't. As Laura's presentation earlier demonstrated, in France, for example, you can't collect demographic data by law. So there are a lot of different nuances that we're currently working with a lot of our partners across Europe to make sure that we're enabling them to adhere, to collect, to analyze, and also to report on all of those critical elements, because the fines do range up to 10 million euros, which, to be honest, isn't a lot of money for some of these companies, but actually the reputational damage, the damage to investors, and also with employees, I think has a much greater significance and impact than actually financial fines. Of
So
course,
Daniel,
sorry, Lauren.
I was going to say, imagine I am a Canadian headquartered company and I've got, a branch in Portugal and a branch in, let's call it France. Do I have to follow these regulations?
You do, absolutely. Wherever your head office could be in Chicago, but as you said, you might have an office in Portugal or Berlin or London. You absolutely have to report on these guidelines.
And so imagine I don't. And imagine, I also have a plant in Germany, also have a plant in Sweden. Can all four of those countries go after me, or is that 10 million euro fine the maximum?
Unlike you, Laura, I'm not a lawyer, so
The answer is all of them.
I wouldn't want to give any legal advice, as this is being recorded as well. But I would think that any company is going to be working quite closely internally with legal counsel and compliance, but then also working with external partners like Diversio to make sure that any reduction in risk is absolutely maintained, but also making sure that you can work with experts and partners that have the experience of doing it to make sure that we're enabling them to be compliant. But yeah, I think as you've seen historically, the EU is incredibly well known to come after anybody, whether it's a $14 billion fine to Apple, and I think Google was 11 or 12 billion, but the size of the company has no relevance at all. They're very, very determined to ensure this is very much a regular practice. And also, we're only really on day one today. It's going to change, it's going to evolve. So the quicker, the faster, the more efficient companies can start understanding data collection, people, demographic data, then we can start building that in and year out. So reducing any nervousness and anxiety, but more importantly, financial and also reputational risk.
Thank you, Daniel. And for the audience, we did not practice this in advance. So just kind of quickly, there are cumulative fines, which I think is interesting. In the EU, each country is able to enforce. So a lot of things to consider there. Okay, so what's coming? And I think for those of you who, like me, check your Apple News app every morning, which is probably poor for my mental health, it feels like it's unpredictable and it's unclear, particularly in the US. I think what we've seen and heard anecdotally is that Europe has almost been like a steady march towards, DEI reporting, ESG reporting, sustainability reporting. Canada, probably quite similar. The US feels a little bit erratic, and it feels a bit like, we're on one end of the spectrum and then all of a sudden we're on the other end. But we did our best to try to think through what is likely given the president's comments and the way the administration going, what is likely to happen. So we think that EEO reporting, which is a real cornerstone of regulation in the US, it is possible that this will be paused. And the indicator that, suggests that to us is that the president did remove one of the EEO directors. And the underlying question is whether that means that the EEO will be more of an enforcement agency for reverse discrimination. So nothing concrete has happened here, so steady state as it stands, but we're keeping a close eye on developments in that particular space. But on the flip side, it's equally, almost inevitable that the executive orders will be challenged in court. And so 4 organizations quite well known have already indicated that they will challenge the executive order on illegal DEI. And there is again, I'm a lawyer, there's a very strong case to be made that they're not constitutional. And I think what I find it interesting is there are state bar associations, which is the industry body for lawyers who themselves have DEI programs in place, have come out and declared, look, nothing that we do is illegal. We stand behind our programs and we're happy to take it to court. So that will, TBD how it will land, but that is likely to happen. And then what's been really interesting, and this is our not our initial prediction, to be completely honest, but as we have more discussions, I'm increasingly convinced that companies, if they don't double down, which more are doubling down than I thought, will reposition, they won't retreat. And so in that very same event, after Trump spoke at Davos, Reuters went and spoke to a number of CEOs who were in the room and came across several that said, look, this is part of our business strategy. I want to be the leading bank. I want to be the leading consumer goods company. I want to be the leading fashion retailer. I need to have a strong workforce. We're not backing down. And I kind of liked, Bank of America, Brian Moynihan, quite simply said this has commercial logic. So I think we saw even right away that there were companies that said, look, this is part of what we do and who we are, and it's for business results. So we can't eliminate the sentiment. And so, again, this was surprising for us. So to be transparent, when the executive orders started to come in place, we quickly jumped on the phone with all of our American clients to, talk them through what was happening, how they wanted to approach it. And I think out of our first 20 calls, 19 said that they were doubling down, and 1 said that they were going to reposition. And the one that's repositioning, 40% of their revenue comes from the US government. They're a military defense company. And so that was the first indicator for us. Okay, maybe this backlash isn't as widespread as it might seem to be in the news. And so as the weeks go on, we are seeing, am I frozen? No, okay. We are seeing companies, kind of leaders in their industry, come out and say, as Novo Nordisk did, this is essential to who we are and how we perform and why we're in the lead. and we're not backing down. And I love the kind of, Evan Davis, Daniel, in the BBC podcast that you did. I loved he posed the question, why are we letting politics dictate business decisions? We should let business dictate business decisions. And so we had, I'm an alumni, so I was proud to see that McKinsey came out yesterday, alumni email, and then reported in Bloomberg. They're not backing down. Inclusion is essential to the advice they give to clients. Of course, Goldman Sachs, everybody follows what they do. Apple, Cisco, Deutsche Bank was mentioned, Salesforce, Ben & Jerry's, historically leaders in the space. And then on the other kind of in the middle here, you do have companies that, again, headline grabbing, are appear to be backing off of DEI, but when you really read the comments and you look into their policies, they've effectively rebranded diversity, equity, and inclusion into something like, merit, accessibility, and belonging. The word inclusion, we specifically looked for that word, appears in all of the yellow companies' policies and statements. And so that concept does not seem to be controversial at the moment. It does seem to be something folks are sticking to.
Zakeana, we've had a few questions from the floor. Would you care to take one while we refresh Laura's screen?
Yeah, why don't I dive into some of the Q&A here?
Yeah. So how can we encourage underrepresented groups to voice unmet needs if the feedback is anonymous? And as you know, all of the data collection that we do at Diversio is completely anonymized.
Yeah, this is a challenge that so many organizations face. And really, it comes back to, have you set a table, so to speak, for safety, psychological safety in the workplace, to allow people to come forward and share what their personal lived experience is and what the challenges they face are and how they might, the suggestions they have. But really it comes back to, Daniel, have you spent the time to create that safe space for people to feel, even anonymously, to feel like they have the ability to speak up?
Anonymous feedback and data collection is often grouped by artificial intelligence into themes and into contexts. It takes away individual and identifiable elements, whether it's a location or a department. So again, it's something that people can always feel safe to do, and there's no direct feedback, particularly if it's a line manager or some aspect around your organization. Laura, welcome back.
Thank you. I'm sorry about that. I'm going to blame the snow day.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry to interrupt, and I want to leave time for Q&A, so I will be quick with the rest of these slides. Last thing I'll say, absolutely, there are companies that are backing down, so I want to be honest about that. And there are some trends, which I'm sure you can see, that I won't get into. So I think, what does this mean? And I'm not sure where the Q&A has gone in the chat, but I can imagine folks are thinking, what should I do? There's a lot of information, a lot of conflicting trends. There really is no easy answer. And so this is very boring, but the way that I tend to think about big strategic decisions is, number one, look at risk. So there is, unfortunately, in this situation, particularly if you're international, but even if you have employees, there is no risk-free decision. And so looking at the US, for example, and we kind of, these are the two ends of the spectrum. There absolutely is a middle ground, but doubling down in the US does carry some political risk and a bit of some enforcement risk, depending on where the administration goes. But low operational risk. If you believe that an inclusive workplace is good for business, doubling down is the right thing to do for outcomes. On the flip side, if you back down, low political risk, flying under the radar right now is, the low risk option, but high operational risk. Because if you truly back off these programs, you'll lose the benefit of retention, the benefit of talent attraction, the benefit of engagement and productivity. So those are two, conflicting tensions. In the European Union, not the United Nations, of course, doubling down is low risk across the board. It's good for performance, it's good for reporting, it's high risk to do nothing, to back down because you have to report on it, and it doesn't look great if you have nothing to say. And then, of course, operationally. And so the way that we are talking to our clients about this topic, as I mentioned, we've had very few, really none, companies that want to fully back away and truly eliminate their programming in this space. And so the options are really, there's two of them. So number one is to stay the course, keep doing what you're doing, double down, or as one of my European clients said yesterday, we're doubling up. And then the second is refocus on something like merit, accessibility and belonging, or culture first. And so that's the second option is, as we saw earlier, there are some programs that are more controversial. There are some that are much less. And so, take a bit of a spin through the programs to make sure there's nothing that, would be particularly egregious in the eyes of the administration, and really double down quietly on the programs that are working. And so I will not read the squall of text, but in terms of what option works best for what company, we find that companies or sectors like tech, financial services, professional services where it's essential to attract top talent, probably being more visible with your DEI efforts is going to better position you to attract that diverse slate. Companies, of course, that are reliant on things like federal contracts, probably the option 2 is the responsible and the smart way to go. So as Daniel mentioned, we are here to help. We can work with you on either end of the spectrum, absolutely, and I think have a very good understanding of what's possible and what's expected in the US and also internationally. And so please, we are your partner. So if you want to double down, if you want to refocus in terms of storytelling, narrative, data collection, auditing, assessing your programs and policies, please reach out to any of us, and we're really here to help. So
Thank you,
I'm
Laura.
going to end here.
Should we, we've quite a few questions. Zakeana, Laura, please, if you want to take this. How do you balance DEI initiatives as a Canadian company with compliance requirements for a US subsidiary? So, I'll let you guys take this one.
I've got a lot of opinions about that. But I think one of the things, having gone through a similar challenge when I was actually looking at an organization's safety program, is where are the highest requirements and what are the, as Laura's mentioned and Daniel's mentioned, what are the risks of bringing your program up to those levels, meaning you're going to be higher than what's expected, that bare minimum compliance level in some areas, which could cost money in order to implement. But really, understanding what the impacts and the risks are of not doing it and of treating people in different areas differently, I think will have a much greater impact than having a set standard, whether you're Canadian or you're US. We have a level that we treat everyone. Laura, what about you?
Yeah, the way that I would think about it, and we've worked with clients several in this position, step one is, what is the law? In both regions that you operate in, you have to comply with the law. And so in Canada, there are reporting obligations, but particularly if you're a federal contractor. In the US, as we've just gone over, the laws prohibiting DEI are actually quite narrow at the moment. So if you are, again, a federal contractor or a federal agency, then having a DEI program, particularly one that prioritizes quotas, affirmative action, et cetera, that is going to be something that might bring you on the wrong side of the law. But you have this other world universe of laws like Title VII, like EO reporting, et cetera, that you have to comply with. So step one is I would look at my Canadian headquarters, my US subsidiary, make sure I comply with the law. I think, to be honest, most of our Canadian clients are more concerned with headline risk than they are with actual legal compliance. And so then the question becomes, who are you most concerned with? What stakeholder? If you're a very heavily consumer-facing company, you may be more influenced by what your customers think. If you're a talent-focused business, you're probably more concerned with what your employees think. And so then I would think through, okay, what are the risks of backing down or appearing to back down to my employees if I'm a talent-first organization? How are my diverse employees going to feel? How are my employees with a disability going to feel? On the flip side, if I, for example, am targeting selling a product to an audience where anti-wokeism has really taken hold, then I might want to adjust my language. So that's the way that a lot of our clients are thinking about it.
Cool, thank you. I think we covered the second question a little bit at the beginning, but maybe we can add some more to it now. How might the Trump administration's stance, sure it's a stance, on DEI impact private global organizations this year?
Yeah. So our position, and again, unpredictable. The president has signaled an intent to enforce anti-DEI rules, according to him, against private companies. At the moment, frankly, I don't know what he would enforce because there is nothing that's been congressionally approved as a law. But it is possible that the enforcement would make an argument that discriminating through hiring quotas, for example, against straight white men is actually contrary to equality laws in the US. So it is possible, again, that laws that historically were used to benefit diverse individuals, underrepresented individuals, will now be used to protect more dominant individuals. So no, kind of without any opinion or judgment there. I think that's why it's so important to take a look at your policies, and the most at-risk ones, like hiring quotas, rethink them. So again, at the moment, the law applies specifically to federal contractors and federal agencies, and the remaining DEI legislation in the US remains in force.
Okay, cool. Maybe I'll take this one. You showed a chart with EU being the most progressive, but Italy, an EU country, beautiful EU country, by the way, far behind. Can you explain more? Do you notice anything in the approach of governments from other big economies like Spain, Germany, or Poland? As the slide, I think it was 11, which we're going to share with you afterwards, Italy it's kind of around the middle, moderate restrictions on D&I. There's currently a rather right-wing government. LGBTQ plus rights and EU efforts have been scaled back with restrictions on parental leave for same-sex couples. Yeah, I think overall they have made strides across D&I through legislative changes, obviously as part of the EU, particularly related to gender equality. But compared to the other countries within the EU, it's definitely within the lagging behind, could do better scorecard. There are concerns around cultural attitudes, which are variably historical attitudes, and also, again, it's historical stereotype, but it's a lack of robust enforcement mechanisms, particularly, as I said, regarding LGBTQ rights and racial equality, which I think does, what we've articulated today, put forward quite a strong argument that the cultural political climate in Italy could somewhat be against D&I initiatives. Haven't seen that across other countries. You mentioned Germany, and that would be absolutely within the far left of the spectrum that we reported on today, and the same with Poland as well. I hope that answers your question. Another question: for companies offering DEI-related HR business services to US companies, are there any possible legal risks for a company if we remain physically on Canadian soil?
Zakeana, do you want to take that one, or do you want me to?
I was going to leave that to the lawyer and the American.
I would have to understand the facts of the case.
Hypothetically,
I can't really comment. I do remember, again, speaking candidly, for a moment in Florida, DEI training was under fire, and we do DEI training. And my mom lives in Florida, and I did have a moment where I was like, can I go to Florida? But it's really dependent on the type of services offered. Again, if you are a federal contractor yourself, it would really depend.
Okay, cool. Well, I think we can definitely answer this one. For companies who are doubling up or doubling down, which I think is the same, how do you equip employees to represent this commitment through their everyday activities, i.e. on the front line? Are there any resources that we can direct them to?
I will, and Zakeana, I'd love your thoughts. For me, now is the time to reiterate the business case. I think that's uncontroversial. Articulate the why we're doing this. Absolutely, a lot of leaders, great leaders, it's the right thing to do, and that creates great employee sentiment and loyalty and trust. So if that is a reason, make it crystal clear. And then if it's good for your business, to your employees, make it crystal clear. Maybe you're trying to grow into a new market and you need diverse perspectives to help you understand that market. Maybe you are an innovation company and you need great ideas and you know the marketplace of ideas is better with different perspectives. So really articulate for your employees why we're doing this. That will also have the added benefit of gaining buy-in.
While I agree that the why is foundational, my training background is kicking in where I'm like, we can support you with behavioral change. And I think that's part of it, is addressing the underlying attitudes and behaviors, as well as providing really practical, hands-on, day-to-day, what could I do today to demonstrate this in a really practical, easy to implement, doesn't feel weird, awkward, touchy-feely, but that makes sense. How could I simply look around the table at a meeting and go, you know what, we haven't heard from Susan. Susan, do you have anything you want to add? Like small actions like that you can do. So finding those really practical small things and making them everyday habits.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, I think an openness to communications is critical as well, and providing safe spaces for employees on every levels of maturity and understanding have the ability to have their voice heard. So we've got a last remaining question. Zakeana, I might direct this towards your side. Again, you might or might not have an opinion, but if you don't, that would be a first. What are your opinions on the University of Alberta's decision to rebrand DEI initiatives?
I have a lot of thoughts and opinions. So I think one of the challenges here in Alberta is finding a way to meet each person where they are and recognizing that if the language you're using is alienating a large portion of your target audience, then finding the language that will resonate with them in order to continue a conversation in any way, shape, or form is in the long term going to have some benefit. So I think there is value in shifting language if you know that the language you're using is shutting down conversation and prohibiting your message from getting through.
Yeah, agreed. Laura, before we wrap up, do you have any more thoughts?
You know what? I just saw Eloise shared a comment or a question in the chat that I love, and it's such a good idea. It was around the business case and the fact that Diversio, we have data. We are operating globally, so we know the spectrum of benchmarks. And we know a lot about the business impact of working with us over time. And spoiler alert, it's very good. Retention goes up, engagement goes up, productivity goes up, sick days go down. So I think, Eloise, the suggestion to publish more on the business case to support leaders right now in making that case, absolutely, we will do that. Absolutely. And I think, Kate, we did a deep dive yesterday on our, content strategy. We should absolutely do a big push on that front. And I do want to open the floor. Any ideas on how we can support you? Like, for example, we're about to put out a number of blogs that kind of demystify what's going on right now, add a little bit of clarity and facts to the conversation. If anybody has ideas on what we can do to help you, we are ready to rock, ready to go. Please let us know, and we'll do our best.
Okay. Well, I think, thank you, Laura, Zakeana, everybody for making the time today to join us. I imagine our lovely marketing folks are going to follow up with this presentation afterwards. There'll be some links if you want to have some more conversations, links to materials, supporting guides as well. And as Laura said, any thoughts, suggestions, recommendations you've got, how that we can further support you all, you know where we are. And we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you all. Bye-bye.